Hi, Howie. Good morning.
Oh, wait a minute. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. There we go.
I'm gonna quickly go first review.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hello, Shlomo. Okay. Hope everyone's had a chance to have breakfast.
No.
Later.
Okay. Let's say that. Tough. So let's carry on. Yesterday we began Masechet Beitzah. So we're on the first daf, on the first Amud, on the first Mishnah. So just to recap again, we're talking about the first din of the Mishnah. It says Beitzah shnoda b'yom tov, Beit Shammai omrim ta'achel, Beit Hillel omrim lo ta'achel. We have an egg which is laid on Yom Tov. Beit Shammai says it can be eaten, it's not muktzeh, you can do whatever you want with it. Beit Hillel say no, it cannot. Obviously, again, by the way, Beitzah shnoda b'yom tov, these dinim apply to Yom Tov and not necessarily to Shabbos, because on Yom Tov you can cook the egg, so then there'd be no problem with that, no problem with muktzeh from that perspective. And again, as we first understand, it just seems to be an ordinary Yom Tov. The Mishnah doesn't say anything to indicate that it's anything otherwise. But we will see, at least according to one of the opinions, that's not the case. It said there are going to be 4 different explanations in the Gemara as to what case the Mishnah is talking about, why we have this machloket Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So the first suggestion that we have is a pin of Rav Nachman. Maybe again, let's just read the Gemara very quickly, just to recap what we saw yesterday. So the Gemara said, "B'may askinan, what are we dealing with? What's the case? Where does this egg come from? Ileima, b'tarnagolet ha'omedet la'achila, matamay Beit Hillel." Therefore, if we say that we're dealing with a chicken, which is there has been designated to be eaten. Right, we said the chicken can be designated either la'achila or can be designated for legadel beitzim, to grow eggs. If it's designated to be eaten, then we understand that the chicken itself is not muktzeh because you could shecht it and you could eat it, and therefore the egg which is inside is part of the chicken and it's like separating food, right? Why would Beit Hillel over here forbid it? Again, this is one of the unusual cases where Beit Hillel are the ones that are stringent. He says, it's a food which has been separated. Have a look at Tosfot over here, third Tosfot on the page. He says, perush, ochel anifrad min ha'ochel, food which is separated from food. And the egg has now been separated from the chicken. He could have shechted it, meaning before it had laid the egg, and eaten the chicken with everything inside, and therefore there's no reason to distinguish between that. So according to Beit Hillel, it doesn't make sense. If it's tarnagolet ha'omedet le'achila, everything should be permitted. So Ela says the Gemara, Ela b'tarnagolet ha'omedet legadel beitzim, ma'tamay de Beit Shammai. So if you say no, we're dealing with an egg, with a chicken which is there for laying eggs, so then I understand why it would be muktzeh. At this point, I don't understand the opinion of Beit Shammai. It says it's permitted. Right? Muktzeh. Answer is that it would be muktzeh. Meaning, that's a question. Muktzeh, you're going to say, according to Beit Shammai, right? That you're not going to say that it's muktzeh. My kusha, dilma Beit Shammai leidlu muktzeh. So maybe you'll say no. You'll say according to Beit Shammai there is no concept of muktzeh. And again, as we explained yesterday, not to say there is no concept of muktzeh at all. Everybody has a concept of muktzeh. But the question is, how far do we go? We'll see. There's certain cases, certain machlokot, which some Tanaim hold that the dinim of muktzeh would apply, and some hold that it does not. So when we say Late Lu Muktzeh, I mean they aren't as stringent when it comes to Muktzeh. Dilma Beit Shammai, Late Lu Muktzeh. So Kasal Kadatin Afilu Man Deshali B'Muktzeh B'Nolad Asul. In other words, at this point, the kasha on this explanation, the kasha on Beit Shammai is that even if you assume that Beit Shammai are not as stringent when it comes to the laws of Muktzeh, nonetheless, when it comes to Nolad, they will be, because Nolad is something that was not even in the world at all. If you have a look at Rashi says Kasal Kadatin. He says Lahachi Palchinan. Might amount to Beit Shammai. The Kasal Kadatin. The Afilu Rabbi Shimon the Shali b'Muktzeh b'Nolad Asid. Right? You would have thought the following. You would have thought even according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is the one who we say says that we're going to have a machloket here, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, as to whether we say Muktzeh or whether we don't say Muktzeh. Rabbi Shimon is the one who says we allow Muktzeh. In other words, many types of Muktzeh, Rabbi Shimon is going to be lenient on. Even then, he says b'Nolad Asir. But when it comes to Nolad, he does not extend that leniency over there. Why? The ilu b'Muktzeh, says Rashi, the ilu b'Muktzeh svira lei lo maktienish midate midi dechazile. He says, why is he more lenient about Muktzeh? Right? What does Muktzeh mean? Muktzeh means that it's set aside. So he says, we don't say, right? Lo maktienish midate midi dechazile. We don't say that a person sets aside in his mind, why is something muktzeh? Because you have no use for it on Shabbat or Yom Tov. You're not going to, you set it aside because there's nothing you can do with it. So Rabbi Shimon holds, there's something that potentially has a use, so we don't say a person sets it aside. We therefore don't say it muktzeh. That is something that already exists. Aval nolad, lo hava yada denavei datei elave. But it's something that's nolad, it's something that before Shabbat comes in, doesn't actually exist yet. You can't say that you designate in your mind to use it because it's not there. You don't know that it's going to be there, and that's and therefore there's a distinction at this point, distinction havamina between muktzeh and nolad. Interesting discussion in the Rishonim over here when it comes to nolad. Again, if a person knew that something was going to come into the world, right? Let's say that you knew the chicken was going to lay the egg, and you designated in your mind then before Shabbat, before Yom Tov, would that be reason? Would the svara still apply? That's going to be a machloket rishonim. Just want to have a look at the Rashi before that, which was skipped. Rashi over there, where he says late lu muktzeh, just to explain a little bit more this distinction between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, between these different Tanaim who say sometimes we do say muktzeh, we don't say muktzeh. So says here Rashi. It's near the top, near where the Mishnah starts. Rashi that says late lu muktzeh. He says the Dilmak Rabbi Shimon sviralu the Amar b'per kira mutal hashemen shebaneh v'shebekala asul v'Rabbi Shimon matin. So we have in the Gemara in Shabbat talks about mutal hashemen shebaneh, where you have oil that's left over in the candle. Right? Candles, I'm sure everybody's seen the candles in the times of the Mishnah are very, very different to the candles that we have today. You imagine you have sort of this clay pot which you put oil inside, and then there's a wick that goes in, and the wick will draw from the oil, and that's how you light the candle. That's why the Mishnah in Shabbat tells us that you can't tilt the candle. When you think about tilting a candle, it's not talking about a wax candle that just it doesn't matter if you tilt it or not, it will still light. But if you have these oil candles, which sometimes if the oil is running low and the wick is not drawing well, so you would tilt the candle in order to draw the wick and in order to cause the light to come up. So on Shabbat, the candle itself is going to be muktzeh, because if you tilt it, either if you're drawing the oil onto the wick, that's going to be the malacha of mav'ir, of lighting the candle. And if you tilt it the other way, and if you're pulling the oil away, or you're taking the oil out of the candle, that's going to be the malacha of mechabeh, of extinguishing it. So therefore, when the candle is lit, the oil inside becomes muktzeh. This is what's called muktzeh mechmat isur. It's going to be muktzeh because of an isur, because you can't touch it, you can't handle it, because you'll cause an isur to happen. Again, different to a kli shemelachto isur. This is muktzeh mechmat isur, whereby touching it, that causes the actual isur to take place. And then, so everybody agrees that when the candle is lit, the oil itself is muktzeh. what happens when the candle's finished? The wick is burnt out or whatever it is. And then you have motal hashemen. So you have oil that's left over in the candle. So the beginning of Shabbat, this candle was lit and all the oil was muktzeh. Now the candle is no longer lit, but there is still oil that is left over. That's motar Hashem and shebaneh v'shebakara. That's the oil which is left over in the candle, left over in the bowl. So Rashi tells us, quoting the Gemara in Shabbat, says it's asur. It's going to be muktzeh. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon allows it. Okay, so this is one of the cases. This is one of the examples where we say Rabbi Yehuda has muktzeh and Rabbi Shimon does not have muktzeh. Why? What's the case? But something that was muktzeh at the beginning of Shabbat, do we then say that extends throughout the whole of Shabbat? And this is how we paskin according to Rabbi Yehuda, that yes, that it's still muktzeh, but according to Rabbi Shimon, no. Okay, and there are many other examples. There are other cases, but that's what we mean when we say one has muktzeh and one doesn't have muktzeh. So at this stage, we think that machloket that might exist would not exist regarding nolad. It would exist regarding muktzeh, but it would not exist regarding nolad. So now says the Gemara, we're about probably a little bit past halfway down the Amud, in the middle of the line where it says Amar of Nachman. This is going to be a resolution number one to what the Mishnah is talking about. Amar of Nachman leolam. He says yes. In fact, our Mishnah is talking about a chicken which was designated for laying eggs. So muktzeh is potentially a problem. In other words, yes, there is going to be a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai regarding, just like Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, regarding to what extent we say that Rabbanan invoked these prohibitions of muktzeh, but we aren't going to separate between muktzeh and nolad. So the one who's stringent about muktzeh is going to be stringent about nolad as well, and the one who's lenient about it is going to be lenient about nolad as well. And therefore, the whole machloket, according to Rav Nachman, whole machloket you have between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai about this egg is whether we say muktzeh or we don't say muktzeh. That's it. Right, so the itlei muktzeh itlei nolad, the leitlei muktzeh leitlei nolad. Beit Shammai k'Rabbi Shimon, uBeit Hillel k'Rabbi Yehuda. So, and therefore Beit Shammai holds like Rabbi Shimon, and therefore they are lenient. They say no muktzeh in this case, and therefore the egg can be consumed. And Beit Hillel hold like Rabbi Yehuda, who say yes, there is muktzeh, and therefore it is forbidden. Okay, the Gemara now is going to examine whether that's the case. We've just said that Rav Nachman understands that Beit Hillel, who we, generally speaking, Halacha Paskins, we follow like Beit Hillel, holds stringently regarding muktzeh, and that Beit Shammai holds leniently regarding muktzeh. The Gemara is now going to question whether that is in fact the view of Rav Nachman. Umiyamar Rav Nachman Hachi, says the Gemara, does Rav Nachman really hold this is the case? Why? V'hatnan, we have a Mishnah. We have now a Mishnah in Shabbat. We're going to go into a little bit of a discussion here about muktzeh in various contexts. V'hatnan Beit Shammai omrim magbiin me'al hashulchan atzamot uklipin, uBeit Hillel omrim mesalekta tavla kula u'mena'ala. So yeah, we have a discussion when one is eating, one has all sorts of bones and shells of different foods which are left over. So again, when you had the whole food, that was when you were eating it, that was fine. But when you have just the peels or the or the bones or the shells, whatever it is that are left over, so these in and of themselves would now be muktzeh. That's going to be the question. How does one handle them? How does one get rid of that? So the Mishnah says like this: Beit Shammai omrim magbiin mel hashulchan atzamot uklipin. Beit Shammai says you just pick them up. You pick up off the table these bones and these peels, whatever it is. In other words, we're not concerned about muktzeh, according to Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says no, you can't pick them up. You have to lift up the table. If you had some sort of a board that was on the table, you could lift it up, and therefore you could just throw everything out in that way, and shake it off, because we are concerned about muktzeh. Okay, Adkan, all good. That's exactly the opinion here of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is exactly what we expect, what the way of Nachman just explained it. But here's the problem. V'amar Rav Nachman, that was the words of the Mishnah. But Rav Nachman says, Anu ein lanu ela Beit Shammai k'Rabbi Yehuda uBeit Hillel k'Rabbi Shimon. Rav Nachman says over there, the Mishnah which tells us how Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai hold regarding muktzeh, Rav Nachman switches it around. He says that's not correct. He says our tradition is that Beit Shammai holds like Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, Beit Shammai are stringent regarding muktzeh. Beit Hillel, Rabbi Shimon, and Beit Hillel are going to be lenient regarding muktzeh. Exactly the opposite. So there by Shabbat, Rav Nachman is telling me the opposite of what Rav Nachman has just told me over here regarding Yom Tov. Right? Again, our question is, how does the Rav Nachman gave us an explanation of the Mishnah, which works. It's simply machloket regarding muktzeh, but the opinions that Rav Nachman plugged into our Mishnah of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are exactly the opposite of what Rav Nachman tells us their opinions are regarding Shabbat in this Mishnah of Atzamot v'Klipim. So that's the question. So now, this and here is the answer of Rav Nachman. We are 5 lines from the bottom of the Amud, the last word. Amar lacha Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman would give you the following answer. Gabei Shabbat desatam lantana k'Rabbi Shimon. He says regarding Shabbat, where says essentially what Rav Nachman is going to say is this: that there is going to be a difference between Yom Tov and Shabbat. Meaning you're correct when you said that there's a contradiction in how Rav Nachman understands the opinions of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai regarding muktzeh, because in the Mishnah about Yom Tov, Rav Nachman told me that Beit Hillel are stringent about muktzeh. In the Mishnah regarding Shabbat, Rav Nachman told me that Beit Hillel are lenient regarding muktzeh. Rav Nachman will say that is correct. There is a difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov. And we go according to the Stam Mishnah. He's going to give us now a few different Mishnayot. But the Stam Mishnah, when Rabbi arranged the Mishnayot, so sometimes we know that we have Rabbi Meir Omer Kacha, or Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kacha, or Rabbi Akiva Omer Kacha. But sometimes you have Stam Mishnah. Now, Stam Mishnah is also opinion of one of the Tanaim who said it. But Rabbi wrote the Mishnayot in such a way that where we have Stam Mishnah, it's not said in the name of anybody. Generally speaking, that's the way that we paskin halacha. Generally speaking, that's the way that Rabbi wants us to understand that Stam Mishnah is the accepted opinion. So what Rav Nachman is going to tell me now is like this. He says, if you look at the Stam Mishnah when it comes to Shabbat and the Stam Mishnah when it comes to Yom Tov, the Stam Mishnah seems to imply that on Shabbat we are going to be lenient about muktzeh, and on Yom Tov we're going to be stringent about muktzeh. And if the Stam Mishnah was written that way, well, Stam Mishnah is how we paskin halacha, and Beit Hillel is how we paskin halacha, and therefore, however the Stam Mishnah is written, that's the opinion of Beit Hillel. So Rav Nachman is going to say to you, don't ask a question on me, ask a question on the Stam Mishnah. And of course, the Gemara will do exactly that. Once we understand Rav Nachman, because the Stam Mishnah is different, the Gemara will say, well, why is the Stam Mishnah different? What was Rabbi thinking? Okay, but step by step. So Rav Nachman says like this: Amar lacha Rav Nachman, Gabei Shabbat desatam lantana k'Rabbi Shimon. He says when it comes to Hilchot Shabbat, when it comes to muktzah on Shabbat, we find that the Stam of the Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Shimon. In other words, to the one who says late muktzah, that we don't have muktzah, that we don't increase all the stringencies of muktzah. Again, with this discussion, always important to remember in the background that muktzah is entirely a rabbinic prohibition. Doesn't make it any less important, but that means that if it's a rabbinic prohibition, so the rabbis can decide when it applies and when it doesn't apply. So he says like this: where do we see in Shabbat that we are more lenient, so to speak? Titnan. Mishnah says like this: Mechatchin et hadluin lifnei habeima vet hanevela lifnei haklavim. So the Mishnah says that we can cut on this regarding Shabbat. One can cut dluin is sort of a type of vegetable. You're cutting it up for an animal. Veta nevela lifnei haklavim. You're cutting up a corpse of a dead animal for dogs to feed them. Right? Now, it says Rashi over here. So there's really two dinim in the Mishnah. The first one, mechatchinet ladluin, is not so relevant to the din of Mishnah of the muktzeh. Rashi tells us he's mechatchin dluin Tlushin lifnei habeima. First of all, they are tlushin, that they've been already plucked from the ground. These are not vegetables which are connected to the ground, because if they were, that in itself would be a prohibition. But tlushin lifnei habeima v'lo amrinan tircha delav tzorechu. We aren't going to say that it's an unnecessary tircha to cut it up for the animals. That is permitted. Okay, but the din which concerns us more right now, it's a nevela lifnei haklavim. Says Rashi, afal pi shenitnabla b'Shabbat. Even though this nevela came about on Shabbat. In other words, the animal was still alive before Shabbat. That's the reason, as animals you're going to feed to your dogs. That's the reason why you didn't cut it up before Shabbat, because it was not yet a nevela. Therefore, when it came to Ben Hashmashot, when Shabbat began, it would have been muktzah, because it was not fitting to be fed to the dogs, because it was still alive. Afilu achi shali.
Alive still.
Nonetheless, we say that it is still permitted. The late lan muktzeh b'Shabbat, that we don't say muktzeh on Shabbat. Again, late lan muktzeh, we have the principle of muktzeh, but it's a code to say that we are going to be more lenient in these matters. Again, this is a similar machloket to what we saw before regarding the shemen shebaneh. The same idea, that why would we not extend muktzah to this item? The question is, do you say something that was muktzah at the beginning of Shabbat needs to be muktzah for the whole of Shabbat, even though at a certain point it now has a use and it can be handled? According to Rabbi Shimon, we say it's permitted. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we say no. So here we see that it's permitted. Again, says Rashi, afal pi from the beginning. Afal pi shenitnabla b'Shabbat ben hashmashot lo hayta omedet lachilat klavim. Even though, right at the beginning of Shabbat, it was not fitting for this use. Nonetheless, it's allowed. The late lan muktzeh b'Shabbat. We aren't going to say muktzeh to this extent on Shabbat, and therefore hilkach magbiin malashulchan demaili b'Shabbat. Therefore, the other Mishnah which we said that you can lift up, you can pick up these peels and bones and leftover foods on Shabbat, which Rav Nachman reversed and said that was the opinion of Beit Hillel, who said that. Mukim leBeit Hillel, the name of Rabbi Shimon. We say it must be Beit Hillel who says like Rabbi Shimon, who says like the Stam Mishnah, which is the more lenient approach. Okay, so again, back in the Gemara. So Amalach Rav Nachman, Gabei Shabbat Satam Lantana Rabbi Shimon, Titnan Mechatchinet Adluin Lifnei Beima, Veta Nevela Lifnei Klavim. So we see here the Stam Mishnah that takes the more lenient approach of Muktzeh regarding Shabbat. Therefore, Mukam La LeBeit Hillel Rabbi Shimon. Therefore, we establish the opinion of Beit Hillel like Rabbi Shimon. In other words, why did our Mishnah with Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, why did Rav Nachman come along and say, turn it around, and say it must be that actually Beit Hillel says this view and Beit Shammai says that view? Because I assume Beit Hillel is the same view as the Stam Mishnah, which over here is more lenient regarding Muktzeh. That's when it comes to Shabbat. However, we're seeing right now that when it comes to Yom Tov, not so simple. Aval. Now over the Amud says, we continue the explanation of Rav Nachman. Aval gabei Yom Tov, when it comes to Yom Tov, the Satam Lantana Rabbi Yehuda. If you look at the Stam Mishnah that talks about the dinim of Muktzah on Yom Tov, you'll find that it does not take the lenient approach, like we just said, regarding Shabbat, of cutting up this nevela. Here it takes a more stringent approach, like Rabbi Yehuda. How so? Titnan. He has our Mishnah. So Mishnah we'll see later on this Masechet. Titnan ein mevakim etzim min hakolot v'lo min hakolah shenishbara b'Yom Tov. So this Mishnah is dealing with cutting wood. You want to cut wood for firewood. So let's say you have beams from that are used as part of the roof, as part of a building, and you have a beam which broke on Yom Tov. So again, at the beginning of Yom Tov, it was there, it was part of this ceiling, or it was part of this building, part of the structure, and it had no use, and therefore at that point it was muktzeh. And now at some point it breaks. So since it breaks, it doesn't have the use that it had before, but potentially it has a new use, which again on Shabbat this wouldn't apply because you can't light a fire on Shabbat. But on Yom Tov, you can light a fire. We'll learn later on the Masechet really the truth is midoraita. From the Torah level, you could light a fire on Yom Tov. Midrabanan, we say no, you can only light from a pre-existing flame. Again, we'll get to that halacha when we get there. But the point is that wood in and of itself does not need to be muktzeh, because you can use firewood. You can add fuel to the fire on Yom Tov. So since it was muktzeh at the beginning of Yom Tov, says the Mishnah that it's still going to be muktzeh later on Yom Tov. Ein mevakin eitzim min hakorot, v'lo min hakor asher nishbar b'Yom Tov. We can't cut off wood from these beams or from the beam that broke on Yom Tov. Now this is the opposite of the Mishnah we saw by Shabbat. There you're talking about a nevela that at the beginning of Shabbat was muktzeh, but it says later on you can't. Well, beginning of Shabbat it wasn't a nevela. That's why it was muktzeh. But then you can cut it up. So we said that was the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Yeah, it says you have a beam which at the beginning of Yom Tov was muktzeh, later on, now it's not muktzeh, but you still can't cut it up. That's like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So you see that the Stam Mishnah, changes. By Shabbat, the Stam Mishnah, the default position is lenient regarding muktzeh. By Yom Tov, the default position in the Mishnah is more stringent regarding muktzeh. So that's what we say. It says the Satam Lantana ka Rabbi Yehuda. Regarding Yom Tov, the Tana, the Stam Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yehuda. Ditnan en mevakin eitzim min hakorot v'lo min hakor asher nishbar b'Yom Tov. Third line now at the top of Amud Bet, towards the end of the line. Mukim la lebeit Hillel ke Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, Rav Nachman is going to establish the halacha of Beit Hillel like Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to Yom Tov. So now that all works out very nicely. So what Rav Nachman is saying is like this: there is no contradiction in terms. Rav Nachman says, we know we have a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon regarding how far we take the stringencies of muktzeh. When I look through the Mishnayot, I find that the Mishnayot regarding Shabbat indicate that we are more lenient. So by Shabbat, we hold like Rabbi Shimon. When I look at the Mishnayot regarding Yom Tov, I see that they are more stringent regarding muktzeh. Therefore, by Yom Tov, we hold like muktzeh like Rabbi Yehuda. How does Beit Hillel hold? Well, Beit Hillel must be Stam Mishnah and Beit Hillel must be the same. Therefore, when it comes to Shabbat, Beit Hillel is more lenient regarding muktzeh. When it comes to Yom Tov, Beit Hillel is more stringent regarding muktzeh. And therefore, the answer, the explanation of our Mishnah of Beitzah shenoda b'Yom Tov, you have an egg which is laid on Yom Tov. It's talking about a tarnagolet almenet legadel beitzim. Talking about a chicken which is designated for laying eggs. And therefore, the default position is that the chicken is muktzeh. And so too the egg will be muktzeh. And that is according to Beit Hillel. According to Beit Shammai are going to be more lenient regarding muktzeh and Yom Tov, and therefore they say that it's not muktzeh. So that is resolution number one. That is Rav Nachman. That is how he explains our Mishnah. Now we've explained Rav Nachman, and we've explained his contradiction based on the Mishnayot, based on the Stam Mishnayot of Shabbat and of Yom Tov. What we have not explained is why there's a contradiction in the Stam Mishnayot. Right? When Rabbi came and arranged the Mishnah, so why did he change it? Why by Shabbat did he establish Stam Mishnah to be like Rabbi Shimon? And by Yom Tov, he established Stam Mishnah to be like Rabbi Yehuda. That is a contradiction. Again, our question here is not on Rav Nachman, but our question is on Rabbi and how the Mishnayot were arranged. So, fourth line, halfway through the line on Daf Bet Amud Bet, Michdei, man satnei lematnitin. Yes, Rav Nachman, you've gone according to Stam Mishnah, but who made the Stam Mishnah? Man satnei lematnitin. Rabbi. That was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, right? Ma ishna b'Shabbat tesatam lan Rabbi Shimon, u'ma ishna b'Yom Tov tesatam lan Rabbi Yehuda. Why then is there a difference? Why regarding Shabbat does Rabbi say stam like Rabbi Shimon, to be more lenient regarding muktzeh, and on Yom Tov satam lan Rabbi Yehuda, on Yom Tov is more stringent regarding muktzeh? And the answer here is somewhat counterintuitive, makes a lot of sense. It says Amri, we say the following: Shabbat chamila v'lo ati lezalzule ba satam lan Rabbi Shimon. Since Shabbat is more chamur, since Shabbat is more stringent, why? Because there are more things that you cannot do on Shabbat. You can't perform any melacha on Shabbat. We know all 39 are forbidden. And therefore, on Shabbat, since everybody knows how serious Shabbat is, we're not worried that people are going to come to take it disparagingly. So, Shabbat Chamir lo ati lezalzulei bei satam lan Rabbi Shimon. Since people will not come to disregard Shabbat, we're not concerned for that. So if the laws of Muktzah are a little bit more lenient, that's no problem. And therefore satam lan Rabbi Shimon to make cap. And therefore the Stam Mishnah is like Rabbi Shimon, who is more lenient. However, Yom Tov the kill, Yom Tov is lighter. Meaning Yom Tov, there's all sorts of things you can do. People say, Yom Tov, you know what? Yom Tov's not really so serious. You can cook, you can carry, you can do all these things. So what's the big deal? Right? Since Yom Tov the kill, v'ati lezalzule, and people will come to be to disregard it, satam lan Rabbi Yehuda de machmir. Therefore, regarding muktzah, we are more stringent, like Rabbi Yehuda, because we're worried that people are going to come and be mezalzel, and therefore we actually have to be more stringent regarding muktzah. And this applies to other things as well. There's a similar, an interesting discussion as well that comes up, used based on a very similar svara when it comes to Yom Tov Sheni. See, it doesn't apply in Israel, but it applies to Chutz La'aretz. All sorts of questions that come up sometimes. People ask about Yom Tov Sheni, and one of the things is that sometimes we are more machmir certain areas because so that people would won't disregard it. But that's the answer over here. The Stam Mishnah is different because when it comes to Shabbat, we can be more lenient regarding muktzah because people won't take Shabbat lightly. But when it comes to Yom Tov, which people may take lightly because so many melachot are permitted, therefore we're more stringent when it comes to muktzah. Okay, so that's the first answer. Ad Kan. That's it for today. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Shabbat Shalom. And
Thank you very much. It was a very nice year.
Very good.
Rabbi.
Thank you.